out there. Welcome to Wake Up to the Bible. I'm Daniel Kaplan. I'm here with my father, Dr. Kaplan. We're going through the books of the law, Genesis through Deuteronomy, over the course of this year. A little portion every day. Although today we have a pretty lengthy portion. We are following the traditional portions, Torah portions, and they have their 7 readings. This is the 6th reading for this week, and it is Genesis 15:7 through 17:6. So buckle up. We're in for a little bit of a ride. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to inherit. And he said, Oh, my master Lord, how shall I know that I shall inherit it? And he said to him, Take me a 3-year-old heifer, and a 3-year-old she-goat, and a 3-year-old ram, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he took all of these and clove them through the middle, and each set his part opposite the other. But the birds he did not cleave. And carrion birds came down on the carcasses, and Abram drove them off. And as the sun was about to set, a deep slumber fell upon Abram, and now a great dark dread came falling upon him. And he said to Abram, Know well that your seed shall be strangers in a land not theirs, and they shall be enslaved and afflicted 400 years. But upon the nation for whom they slave I will bring judgment, and afterward they shall come forth with great substance. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in ripe old age. And in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. And just as the sun had set, there was a thick gloom, and look, a smoking brazier with a flaming torch that passed between those parts. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your seed I have given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenite and the Kenizzite and the Cadmonite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Rephaim and the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Girgashite and the Jebusite. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian slave girl named Hagar. And Sarah said to Abram, Look, pray, the Lord has kept me from bearing children. Pray, come to bed with my slave girl. Perhaps I shall be built up through her. And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her slave girl, after Abram had dwelled 10 years in the land of Canaan, and she gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he came to bed with Hagar, and she conceived, and she saw that she had conceived, and her mistress seemed slight in her eyes. And Sarai said to Abram, This outrage against me is because of you. I myself put my slave girl in your embrace, and when she saw she had conceived, I became slight in her eyes. Let the Lord judge between you and me. And Abram said to Sarai, Look, your slave girl is in your hands. Do to her whatever you think right. And Sarai harassed her, and she fled from her. And the Lord's messenger found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave girl of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? And she said, From Sarai, my mistress, I am fleeing. And the Lord's messenger said to her, Return to your mistress, and suffer abuse at her hand. And the Lord's messenger said to her, I will surely multiply your seed, and it will be beyond all counting. And the Lord's messenger said to her, Look, you have conceived, and will bear a son, and you will call him his name Ishmael, for the Lord has heeded your suffering. And he will be a wild ass of a man, his hand against all, the hand of all against him. He will encamp in despite of all his kin. And she called the name of the Lord who had addressed her El Roi, for she said, Did not I go on seeing here after he saw me? Therefore is the well called Bir Lahai Roi, which is between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore a son to Abram, and Abram called his son whom Hagar had borne Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. And Abram was 99 years old, and the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am El Shaddai, walk in my presence and be blameless, and I will grant my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you very greatly. And Abram flung himself on his face, and God spoke to him, saying, As for me, this is my covenant with you. You shall be a father to a multitude of nations. And no longer shall your name be called Abram, for your name shall be called Abraham. For I have made you father to a multitude of nations. And I will make you most abundant. Oh, excuse me. And I will make you most abundantly fruitful, and turn you into nations, and kings shall come forth from you. All right, well. That is a power-packed section with a lot to talk about. First of all, we have the beginning where God asks him to do this sacrificial ritual, which is interesting. This is the first time I think we have sacrificial instructions being mentioned before. People are just kind of doing it, right? This is the first time I think it's specifically talked about. And the one thing that comes to mind to me is you have the unclean birds coming down on the carcasses, and Abraham, scurries them away. Some nice parallels in Revelation with that. Thoughts?
Yes, one commentary said that the clearing away of the unclean birds was a way of showing how the Israelites would defend themselves against those who sought to deprive them of this promised land, and that they would be successful in doing so. This is called by the Jews the Brit Ben Habatarim, the covenant between the pieces. And from Genesis 15 through Genesis 17, we have covenant 14 times, the word Brit, 2 times 7. So this is a section 15 through 17 regarding the formalization of God's covenant with Abram. And I want to say that if we're careful, we'll understand that the Israelites were not in Egypt 400 years. They were a minority, and they had a lot of pressure. You can read about it in the land where they were, and so they were strangers in a land that was not theirs for 400 years. For about 220 of those years, they were in Egypt, and ultimately were slaves there and went out from there. Um, and the Septuagint, by the way, is quite clear in Exodus 12. But even the Hebrew Old Testament, if you read it carefully, does not say what some people think it says. And I want to read that now. I guess we'll get back into it again later. But I know a lot of people believe they were in Egypt 400 years, but the chronology in the Bible shows that's not the case. But I want to go to Exodus 12, and
You want a moment? I can do
oh,
something while
here
you're
it is. It's
looking. You
right
found
here.
it? Okay.
It's right here. Um, and uh, I was looking for the where it's when they finally left Egypt. Um, uh, yeah, maybe you should stop. Maybe you should pause it.
No worries. While he's looking it up, I just had a comment just to say some Robert Alter notices this, and I thought this was really interesting. Is the sun sets and a deep slumber falls upon Abram, which of course similar verbiage to uh, Adam and his wife, and this is going, or Adam before Eve, excuse me, and this is talking again multiplication. This is the same sort of idea, is that God in that situation God provided a spouse. In this situation God is providing the offspring, but you have that continue effect there.
Okay. In Exodus 12:40, it says, "Now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years." So yes, they lived in Egypt, but the whole sojourn included Canaan. And I'll say more about that uh, when we get further into the 17th chapter. So yes, they lived in Egypt, but the whole sojourn included Canaan. So if you're careful with Exodus 12:40, you won't read into it. And if you look at the Septuagint version, it'll be a lot more clear. So I wanted to mention that. But 4 generations are mentioned here, and I think when you once Abraham has died, I think well, there's 20 generations from Adam to Abraham, and then no, Moses is the 26th generation. So there's 4 more generations after Abram until Moses when they leave. Moses is in the 26th generation. I think he mentions that here, that they're going to come out in the 4th generation, right? That's in the promise in Exodus in Genesis 15, I believe. Um, You're right, the fourth generation. So you'll see that that there were 20 generations by the time you get to Abraham, and then there are four more. Uh, I'm sorry. No, Moses was the 26th generation. So the reason why it says in the fourth generation, let me be clear, is because Jacob goes down into Egypt. So from that point, the time in Egypt is four generations. Jacob, and then Levi, and then Amram, and then Moses. So there's four more. Anyway, it'll come out to be 22, 23, 24. So there'll be four generations before they leave. Um, I may not be saying it right. There may be somebody in between. Yeah, there is. There's Jacob, there's Levi, and then I think there's Gershom, and then there's Amram, and then uh, and then Moses. So you have the four plus Jacob. Now I've got it. All right. So so the prophecy is from the time that Jacob goes down there, four generations, and then they leave, and it also the area here that's covered goes all the way from the Euphrates River to the Wadi El Arish. This is not the term normally used for the Nile, the term River of Egypt. Most scholars would say it's the Wadi El Arish. It's about halfway into the Sinai Peninsula. So it goes all the way from the Euphrates River, which is today the border of Jordan and Iraq, all the way to the middle of the Sinai Peninsula. So obviously, there's a lot more territory there than Israel generally dominated through its history. They were given more territory than generally what they were able to control.
Well, thank you for that. That's very helpful to get all the math right. You got to see it play out in real time, everybody. So you got to see the logic and the inner workings. Um, I think also an interesting parallel here in terms of the Garden of Eden. So you had that deep sleep come upon Abraham, which ties into Eve, but then chapter 16 really kind of ties into Garden of Eden as well, because you've already established before that Abraham is trusting in God, but the instigator of the issue in chapter 16 seems to be his wife, and his wife is concerned about this partly for herself, but it seems that it's also on behalf of her husband. And I would imagine, if this was this big longing, right? I can only imagine when you have infertility issues just as a woman, how troubling that would be, right? And so she comes up with this strategy to deal with the situation, which is a terrible one. And I feel like, just like the Garden of Eden, what this is really talking about is somebody just lacking the personal responsibility, because Abraham basically just kind of goes with this scheme that she comes up with, and as soon as it goes awry, his response is, well, this is kind of your problem. What do you suggest about it? Like, there's just, he in my opinion, he loses a lot of his agency in this. It's like she kind of runs the show, and she makes some poor decisions, and it's about, not pushing back on others who are giving you, bad advice and bad ideas. What do you think?
Well, before I get to that, I misspoke. I want to just get the genealogy clear. There are three branches of the Levites. There's Gershon, there's Kohath, and there's Merari. And the Kohathites is where Moses comes from. Kohath gives us Amram, and Amram gives us Moses. So I wanted to get that clear. So lest you go away with wrong information. It's Levi, and then Kohath, and then Amram, and then Moses. Okay. Now that is everybody clear on that?
Yeah.
There's no confusion.
Got
You're
it.
not confused. If you're not confused, then probably our listeners are not, our viewers. Now, I want to say this. If you study biblical archaeology, you'll see that this was an acceptable way to handle it in those days. In other words, Sarah had a servant, a slave who was attached to her, and the idea was that if the servant had the child, I think she even literally, would lie between the legs of her mistress while giving birth, as part of the ritual, or whatever you want to call it, as part of the legal way to handle it. And so the child, coming out from the servant, somehow in some legal sense, took on the identity of the mistress of Sarah. So it was an acceptable concept at the time. And so what this shows is that in any given time and place in history, there are certain cultural practices which may be generally acceptable, but which are not acceptable biblically. This Abram should have just had one wife, Sarah. And this was not the way that to try to fulfill the promise God gave him. In other words, he in effect, what's the right word I'm thinking of? He acted uh, uh, too hastily. In effect, I'm trying to think of the word, but
Manufactured his own.
he more or less intruded on God's promise, trying to work out his own way. Sarah suggested it, and he went along with it. And as I said, it was an acceptable practice at the time, but still, obviously not in keeping with the spirit of the Bible. One man, one woman for life is the ideal, and Jesus talks about it, for example, in Matthew 19. So it is to be criticized, but at the same time, as far as we understand, it was something that was generally done in those days.
And I think to your point, it speaks to the human tendency to sometimes fudge a little bit in order to accomplish what you think God might want you to do, right? Because he's been promised, and he's like, well, maybe this is really the way. And I would say, considering the situation becomes difficult from him, he probably maybe could have known better, even culturally speaking. As much as I don't want to be too harsh. One thing too is late earlier in Genesis, it mentions that Sarai was beautiful, and I think one reason why it does that is again to put the proper complexion on this, that this is not like, I think I don't want it to I think it's to help you not be like, oh well, of course, a man, he's whatever, and she's younger and everything. I don't think that's necessarily what's going on in this situation. And I think perhaps it's telling you that Sarai was beautiful, because it's not like, that was particularly an issue or something like that. This is specifically to try to jury rig their own solution to what they think God was doing. I think it's fairer to say that that's not necessarily a concern going on here. Um, Particularly, but what you do see immediately, which is the same thing you see in any polygamous situation in the Bible, is it immediately goes sideways, because it's just not stable. There's way too much competitiveness and human jealousy and things. We are just not well programmed for that sort of configuration, despite what a lot of people want to say. And I will say it's becoming more trendy all the time, so it's something to keep in mind, especially since the absolute the absolute prohibitions are really not completely explicit maybe until the New Testament, although you can see this exemplified all the time, no matter what. But we need to keep that in mind, that it's exemplified all the time, that this is not a great solution to problems. Even a clear one like this is a logistical problem. It's still not a great solution.
But I would comment, knowing human nature, Abram's wife in effect pushes this younger woman on him. You would have to he would have to have a lot of character to say no. So just looking at it from just a human nature point of view. Not that I want to take away from Abraham. Abraham is the father of all those who believe. Uh, but what happens to Hagar later is very interesting. Uh, the, uh, in Jewish thought, of course, Gentiles are outside of the covenant, but a Gentile servant is in a little better status, because they're within the community. There's certain things that they do that the community does. Then the woman has even a higher status, an Israelite woman. The highest status is given to the male, because in Jewish thinking, the male has the most rules to obey. So the male has a certain special status. Then the female, then the servant, then the Gentile. And it's interesting, the first time we have a personal theophany after the Garden of Eden, where we really have God literally appearing as a messenger directly. Here, he appears to a Gentile servant who's a female. It's interesting, and this is the first actual theophany, because here we have the angel of the Lord. But in most of your English translations, angel is capitalized, because if you read the account, what's really happening here is that God is appearing as his own messenger. That is to say, this is the Logos, this is the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. This is the Word of God communicating. If you read the passage, uh, you know, it, I'm just reading out of the New King James, that she called the name of Yahweh who spoke to her. You are the God who sees. For she said, have I also seen him who sees me? Then she called the place Ber Lachairoi, which means the well of the one who is alive and who sees me. So actually, we see God appearing as his own messenger, and he appears to Hagar. And as I said, I think that's the first actual theophany of that sort in the Bible after the Garden of Eden.
Yeah, that is very interesting and quite profound if you really think about all the implications to that, for sure. Um, and ultimately, it gives you, after this encounter, it gives you a little bit more timing going on. Now we're at 86, so we're going to have another gap of time in just a minute. So, it's leading us through and it's giving us a sense. And again, to Abram's favor, in Abram's favor, in terms of understanding why he would make this mistake, there was a fair amount of time to wonder how exactly is this going to come about. And what you will notice too is then it gives you, ultimately he's told the three times that he'll multiply, right? Because he told them with the sand, and then he told them with the stars, and then he says, this time he says, walk blameless and I will multiply you. And at this point, Abram is just totally overwhelmed, and he falls on his face. So you almost get a sense there's a little bit of breaking down going on too, that it really kind of needs to sink in. There needs to be a certain amount of time to work out, his relationship before they're going to go to that next step, especially considering what's going to happen, because what's going to happen, with Isaac eventually is a tremendous ordeal considering everything that led up to this. So in order to get to that point, you have to be at a certain level in a relationship.
Culturally speaking, it was a tremendous pressure on a woman to be childless in that culture. You see that all through the Bible. It's also interesting, as I said, this procedure, although it didn't seem to really work out well in Abraham's case, nevertheless, Rachel suggests it later on. So as I said, it's just something that people did back then. Um, and Sarah would be, Abraham was frustrated, but so was Sarah, and they were both very righteous people. But they were both quite old, and no son had come, and so this really did seem reasonable to them. I'd like to say that Yishmael means God will hear, so it's a play on words when you read about it. And I also want to say that when he says he's going to be a wild ass of a man, it doesn't have the same negative connotation back then that maybe we would think of it. The wild ass was wild, but a kind of a majestic animal. It's not so negative as we might think, but it does describe people who would be very, I guess, volatile in their personality, as he describes here, and hard to control.
Yeah, that's a good point. Sometimes when you have biblical metaphors and analogies, you have to think of what the culture thought of them at the time. Because nowadays you hear that word and you usually think of something foolish or just cantankerous and not beneficial. And back then it was, different. So, all right. Any other thoughts on this? Quite a power-packed section going on here. Good.
That yeah.
All right, so thank you so much for joining us. If you have been enjoying this show, and I'm sure you are, please like, subscribe, hit the bell, comment below any questions you have about anything from Genesis to Deuteronomy, because at some point we're going to cover it. We're going through it. So, and if there's anything that we haven't commented about this portion, also let us know, because we read the comments. We'll go back. We'll try to pick them up as we can. And otherwise, we will see you tomorrow.